Welcome to the Operation Move podcast. My name is Zoe, and this week we're going to be talking about non-linear progression. It's episode 100, which is pretty exciting. I wouldn't say I've been putting it off, but it's sort of one of those things is that 100 is a big deal, and it's sort of like, would I have something that would be good enough to talk about? And it sort of like feeds into that whole sort of like perfectionist thing about, you want to do it well, so you do nothing. And also with it being just sort of had only like a couple of weeks of the kids being back at school, and it's only when they're at school that I get access to my office. So it's sort of been one of those things where I was sort of thinking, what should I talk about? Should I talk about Canberra? And then somebody in Run Club asked me about progress, and I thought, well, it can be really easy to look at someone from sort of like where they're at and assume that either they sort of like started at a relatively good level and have just like progressed a little bit, or it's just been continued improvement upon improvement upon improvement. But the reality is that for most people it doesn't work that way. So I thought could be interesting to look at that process as it has been for me over, well, I guess now it's 8 years. I have to remember when it started. I just have to remember how old Piper is, because I remember that's when I started running. So in this episode, I'm just going to be looking at, like progressing, what the bumps in the road were, what the obstacles were, and hopefully out of that you'll be able to create like a better context for what you're doing and a better appreciation for like how those obstacles can help the progress over time. So I started running in 2011. I think that it was probably started around the time that Piper was about 3 months old, but it would have been kind of sporadic, and it probably became more regular, which is more like 6 months. But so, sort of like middle of that year to end of that year. And it was purely just based on getting moving to help me lose some baby weight, because I put on plenty and I did not lose any. So that's sort of how it started. And it started purely as a way of exercising to burn calories and all the usual sort of stuff. And it evolved into something that I was much more interested in, just from like a training point of view, and that enjoying running and enjoying being outside. Ultimately, at first, the vast majority of all my running was on the treadmill at the gym, and which was a deeply uncomfortable experience. And so occasionally I'd get there and the gym would be empty, and that would be very exciting for me. So I started around 2011. And as someone who had very occasionally ran in my 20s, but it was always, just to sort of like, it was always like connected to a weight loss thing, and it never really stuck. And I was never, like, I avoided all forms of running or sports at school. So I was never sort of particularly talented in that way, or necessarily even had an interest in it. I was an avid walker, which helped. I think that you sort of like have a bit of a base fitness there from walking, but I was also a pack-a-day smoker, which didn't help. And I had periods of quitting, like through pregnancies and stuff like that, but I sort of always ended up going back to it. So the breathing was very, very challenging initially. So I sort of just starting with sort of like walk, run, and I just like every couple of times I just progress it a little bit more. And it sort of really appealed to the sort of like logical part of my brain, is that you do this work and then you progress and then you do a little bit more, that kind of thing. And then in I think have to have been towards the end of 2012, I had a very I always had depression, which I quote managed, and I had always had sort of enough resources or enough skills or just enough support or whatever it was that I hadn't needed medication in the past to handle it. But I got into a situation where I was having a severe depression episode, and it was almost bordering on psychosis, just to do with the lack of sleep mostly. I could not sleep at all. And it kind of came out of nowhere, because you kind of think of those depressive episodes are more likely to happen like when you just had a baby, not when your baby is now sort of 18 months and you're out of that really like intense sort of period of time. But that's when it happened. And so I went on medication, and in that time, running was something really that I sort of like clung onto as like a routine thing, and something that at least sort of like got me out the door. And it was time out of the house, and it was also kind of time where, because a lot of the time it would just be running on the lake, not so much if I was on the treadmill, but if I was outside, where like if I was crying or whatever else, it was kind of that could happen without me having to sort of like put on a veneer that would be acceptable to other people, and I didn't have to sort of impersonate somebody who wasn't sick. So that sort of, I think, really created the core of my relationship with running at that point. And it wasn't until I was sort of planning in 2013 to go to Sydney to run I think initially I was planning on doing a marathon, but ended up going with a half marathon. And so at the beginning of 2013, I was training for that, and I got really nasty shin splints, which is a kind of funny story, because after running for a couple of years, my husband had said, you've got to get out of these ridiculous Kmart shoes that you're wearing and get some proper shoes. So I went to a popular chain store to get the shoes fitted, and they put me in totally the wrong shoes, which I spent loads of money on. And then I got these awful shin splints and went to the physio thinking that I got a stress fracture or something, and it's like, no, it's just soft tissue. But so got rid of the shoes. But because of that, I had to have this time off, because I was actually limping at that point. That's how severe the shin splints were. So I had to have some time off, and basically just sort of like started walking, and knew that once like walking was pain-free, then it could progress from there. And to sort of like help alleviate the issues with the shin splints, I started like wearing minimal runners at that point in time. And so I started back with just some really basic sort of like walk run intervals at that stage. And I was like, well, I'll just do what I can do to get myself into an okay shape to just finish whatever the run is in September. And so at this stage, I'm kind of running like maybe 3 times a week, and it's usually sort of during the week, it'll be like 5Ks to 8Ks, sort of like what would take me about like 40 minutes to a bit over an hour. And then sort of like starting to incorporate a longer run on the weekend. And I have very distinct memories of, because at that stage, I wasn't exactly like, I loved the process of running, but the during bit was always a bit challenging, and I often had to sort of like really talk myself into it. Like when I would drive, if I was going to the gym, have to really talk myself to get out of the car, or like I was constantly having these sort of like mental things of like, oh, I could skip today and then go twice in a row, and like all of those sort of like mental battles that you have with yourself. And so the best part for me after I did a run is, because I would sort of do it like one day on, one day off, because I knew that when I did it, that was the longest amount of time before I'd have to go for a run again. And at that stage when I was doing like the long runs, and I'm someone who has always, particularly wouldn't do this for a marathon, but for a half, I've always done the distance in training rather than doing a little bit less and doing the full distance at the event. And it's just, just a bit of a security thing for me. I've done the distance to know I can do it and everything like that. So I'd done that in training and it had been, like over 3 hours or whatever it was. And I would be absolutely wiped when I got home and basically just lie down and go to sleep. And it was challenging to sort of like work that all in, like sometimes I'd be doing sort of like stuff with the kids in the trike and, like a lot of the stuff was done really late at night because my husband was commuting from the Central Coast to Sydney, so he was in the car a lot of the day, so it wasn't a lot of daylight hours that I had to work with. And there was no training plan whatsoever. It was just like I would just go and run for the time that I had to run with the kind of knowledge that I needed to build up the distance for the long run on the weekend. And I had the benefit of running with a friend of mine who was the original creator of Operation Move, and she was a lot faster than me. And it's one of those things where, like you get into an event situation and if somebody's running faster than you can run that fast. And so we did that half marathon together, and that was so much faster than I'd ever run anything before. And so that was sort of like around like 2:20, I think, for that one. So going from 3 hours to that was a massive improvement for me. And then we were doing it again in Melbourne, but because she had more speed in her legs, she did her own thing, and I also did my own thing. And I got to a point where, I don't know, it was like, probably had like 5 to go, and I knew that like I could really kind of like dig in and like enter the pain cave and see what I could do, or I could kind of just get by for the last 5, and I've decided to get by for the last 5. And it was still an improvement being a flatter course and everything, but I wasn't really well recovered from the first one. So that one was like around 2:16. And then at the end of that year, and actually when I came back I would have gotten home from that on Sunday, and I think like 1 or 2 days later I had to, we were moving, so I had to put the kids in the car and drive for 10 hours, which was probably a lot harder than the race, doing it on my own and everything like that. So then we moved up to Northern Rivers, and I entered another half marathon in November, was completely unprepared for the hills and the fact that I was still at this stage smoking. So did that in like over 2:30, something like that. And it was sort of at that point, so we'd moved, I was kind of like getting myself set up. I was working 4 days a week at that stage as a temp for the Department of Housing, and so I was sort of like fitting things in like around work, and I was kind of just had this thing of like, I'd noticed how I just progressed at a much slower rate than almost everyone else. And you have that thing of like that story that you tell yourself of like, oh well, like I'm just genetically, I'm just not built for that kind of thing, like I'm just built for distance, I'm not built for speed, like all of that sort of stuff. And but I had a moment where I was like, is that true? And I was kind of like, well, there's only one way to find out, and that's to actually specifically train for what I'm doing, not just kind of like go off and run. And also at that stage, because I was so interested in running, I had started to sort of read on like a lot of training theory and stuff like that, which I found really interesting. So I created my own training plan. And I was like, I'll do this for, you know, for sort of a period of time, which in my mind, I had like a solid plan of like, all right, if I want to go under what my time is, I need, like, my 5K needs to be faster. So I'll work on the 5K, and then I'll work on the 10K, and then I'll work on the half. So I guess really I was looking about 9 months. My plan was to do that for 9 months, and if there was no improvement, then I can go, yep, okay, I'm just not the person who's going to improve. And it doesn't mean that I'm not going to run, because, you know, I enjoy it no matter what, but it just means that that might not be the goal that I set for myself. So I started doing that. 5K is a great thing to work on over summer, because you don't have to, like, it's brutal, but you don't have to run as far, which, you know, up here in summer, like, doing long runs is pretty, it's an acquired taste. So I started doing that, and the first few shorter races that I entered were pretty underwhelming, but I worked out that that was because I was having some iron deficiency, which was really impacting things. So I sorted out the iron deficiency, and now sort of managed to go cold turkey on cigarettes for a decent amount of time. So that was sort of working for me, and I was starting to get my lung capacity back. And so then I started to be able to get to the point where, you know, things were actually starting to move. And so then in, I guess the first, after those sort of like shorter races through summer that I did, I ended up entering into a half, the Gold Coast Bulletin half, which is actually done in 2 laps, and that's why I've never gone back. I'm not much of a lap runner, and so it was kind of like, I think that was the first time I went sub 2. So I went 1:58. So I'd sort of gone in had made that improvement in a relatively short time, and it wasn't a great day for me because, like, I was getting over a cold and a bit snotty, you know, like there were a few things that didn't go my way, and I was running and you're kind of like trying to get your head into it, and it was feeling really hard. And I just kind of said to myself, there is somewhere within this pace that is comfortable, and you just have to find it. So I did that. I was so happy with that, because that was kind of just me proving to myself, no, like, you can improve, you've just got to train in the correct way to improve. And I was helped along by the fact that I had, around that time, I'd started going to CrossFit. And I don't think it's necessarily specific to CrossFit that it helped improve. I think it's more just anyone who starts adding in strength training, you're going to get a huge benefit in your running. And that's pretty much what happened with me. And then I had Great Ocean Road that year too, which was not that long after, and I'd sort of planned to hope to go sub 2 there as well, but then I ate pizza the night before. My stomach was really all over the shop, and I ended up like having to stop and everything like that. So I was still happy with how it ended up, given that that was going on, but yeah, that was not an overly fun day. And then I went to Gold Coast for the first time, and I had an idea about what I wanted to run, which was, in hindsight, was not based in reality at all. Like, at home, I would run, quote, tempo, which now I would not consider tempo at all. Like, basically I was running like an 8-kilometre time trial. That's what I was doing. And that pace for my 8-kilometre time trial was slower than what my goal pace was for the half. So I don't exactly know why I thought I could do it, but it's just one of those things that sometimes even though numbers are arbitrary, sometimes they can inspire you to do things that are kind of a little bit beyond what you might think that you could do. So my goal was to go under 150, and I did it in 149, and it was really, really hard, but it was really good. But what happened because of that is, at the time, that I didn't really realise, because it was kind of in a marathon build-up, so I was planning to try and go under 4 hours in the Melbourne Marathon that year. And it was definitely like a red line run. Like, I finished and there was absolutely nothing in the tank. Like, it was a struggle to get across the line. And it's just because it's so far beyond any kind of intensity that I'd ever done before. And even though it felt really good, like, to finish at the time and everything, in hindsight, my brain kind of switched off from doing intensity work, because it's like, we don't want to go back there. Thank you. That's enough. And so when I went to Melbourne, like, a few things went pear-shaped, but I was really happy with the run, and ended up being 4:08, which was, a good 20 minutes faster than I'd ever run a marathon before. So even though I really struggled with some stomach distress in the back, there's some cramping too. So, like, basically everything after 25Ks was a little bit challenging. But I think I just ran the first half a bit too aggressively, and so, which is pretty easy to do in a marathon. So I did that, and after that, I think that I just, you sort of, like, you have summer where everything's kind of like slower and a lot more challenging because of the heat, and mentally I was just unable to kind of, like, wrap my head around doing anything. Like, I started working with a new coach at that point. We're like, okay, let's get, like, the 5K back to where it needs to be, and had, like, a really good run in Brisbane for that, where it was sort of like around, like, a little bit over 25 minutes or something like that, which was really good. But then I started hitting some things with the business, and with all the work that I was doing, and it became a solo endeavour, and I was just like, I do not have any headspace for training. And even though at the time it felt like it was sort of a decision I was making in terms of, like, balancing work and everything else, I think it was still a hangover from that Gold Coast run, where my body and mind was like, no, not doing anything hard. I can't even wrap my head around it. I'm just going to do slow and easy, and that is just what I'm going to do, and that's what I did. So for the most of 2000 and I guess it was 2016, or did I skip over a year? 2015. I did. I skipped over a year. So I guess what we were talking about, I did 2014 was that marathon. I think I skipped over the first marathon. That's very annoying, isn't it? Oh yeah, so this is why it's written down. So yeah, so Gold Coast happened with the 149, and then we went and did, and this is still with Kate, went and did Sydney Marathon at 4:26, and that was a really good run for me. I felt pretty good the whole way, as good as you can feel in the last 10Ks of a marathon, but it was really steady, it was really consistent. It's so good running with someone else, particularly over such a long distance, and for that to be the first one, I was super happy with that. And then the following month I did another marathon, but with a friend, so that was more of an easy effort for me. So that was just, it was like 5.5 hours, but there was, you know, like a fair amount of like walking towards the end, so I didn't really feel that out of shape in finishing that. And then I got I was sort of like trying to like work on getting that speed back, and I got an injury, which was an adductor tear. And so then the next sort of few months were like I ran Great Ocean Road again, and then I ran Gold Coast again, but again at easy efforts because I was still kind of like rehabbing that tear. And then I went into that 4:08 marathon. So I'd like condensed all of that down there. So that's actually was the and then I went into sort of like attempting to get that much faster over the summer period with the new coach and the 5K. And then in 2016 things changed with the business, and then I was like I stopped getting coaching, and I just ran. So when I had this kind of idea of, you know, like I will just run marathons, but just at a, you know, at what is like a slow, easy effort for me. I mean, it's never easy. It's like so long, but not really attempting to get any faster, and just like see if that sort of, I was kind of like, you know, like I was sort of like burnt out from like all of that sort of speed work and intensity, and in a lot of ways I think I was thinking like maybe if I could just run super slow and easy, then it would be like a slower improvement, but I would improve over time, and that did not happen at all. So I think like the first marathon I did was in about 5:06. Gold Coast was super flat, was like 4:58, and Brisbane I started losing the will to continue, and it was like 5:26, and I was just like, I cannot do another. It's just a long time to be out there, and I just wasn't enjoying it, and I was just like, yep, this is not sort of working for me at all. And I don't really like marathons, and you know, it was, and I think that you know, it's just one of those things where I can enjoy it a lot more when the time domain is more like 4.5 hours, but once it became like 5.5 hours, no longer so fun. So I decided to just sort of step back from that a bit, and I ran the Sydney half that year with a friend at a, you know, at a kind of like a moderate sort of pace, sort of around, it ended up being like 2:20, and then sort of had worked on 10K a bit for Melbourne that year and got that in like 57 minutes. And then towards the end of that period was when I really started to sort of challenge some of the things that I was telling myself about the running. Like, I think with that, it really all came down to that 1:49 half, which was now, I mean, this is sort of like we're, I guess, at the end of 2016. So was 2 years before, and I'd never gone anywhere near touching that sort of pace since 2014. It's really easy to kind of like tell yourself, well, you know, like I'm just getting older, I'm going to get slower, you know, like that was just like a perfect combination of events, and I'm just not ever going to be that fast again. I don't think I can ever go to that red line place again. And then I had a mile time trial at CrossFit that I was really unhappy with. Just because, like, when we do those sorts of things at CrossFit, there's usually a lift beforehand, and you usually don't have the full warm-up that you would have with running. So it wasn't so much that the time exactly, but I just knew that I could do a lot better than that. And so that inspired me to then go off and do it on my own as a pure running workout with full warm-up, all of that sort of stuff. So I basically did that, did the mile, and then I was kind of having that there, that then was enough to challenge this idea that I couldn't go faster than that half marathon, because the mile time had improved by a full minute. And so why would I think that I couldn't improve this other thing? And so I decided to, like, really challenge that idea. So the next batch of training was all sort of like around that. It was at this stage I was now sort of like working off some custom programming, and which I find great because then I don't think about it. And, it's either custom programming or coaching. It's just like you see it and you just do it. And you don't really have, maybe you do sometimes think, I don't think I can do that, but you do it anyway. So I did that, and it was a bit of a false start because I'd had like a really good cycle and I got really sick and I couldn't go and do the half that I was going to do. But I just ended up doing one on my own at home, and I could see I was close. So I think I did that, and it was like 150 something, and I was like, well, like in a race situation, I can definitely do more than that. And it was an awful day to be doing it. It was like, we just had like all of this sort of like torrential rain and wind, and so there was a big portion of it when I was running into headwind. So I was really happy with where my training was at that point, and so then that was a good point to then sort of build off that. And so then I went into Gold Coast again, and my goal was just to get under that 149, to just sort of like get it out of my headspace as something that I would never be able to top. And I sort of set it up on my watch so that it would have pace guidelines, but I wouldn't see the overall pace or the overall time, to just like keep me in the moment. And I set up like a strategy, sort of the same strategy I always use for half marathons, which is, like it's a negative split sort of thing. So you're starting off slow, and it breaks it up into sort of 5 chunks, where you've got your first 3, and then you've got your middle section of 3 5-kilometre chunks, and then you've got your last 3, and that's sort of also how I construct the fueling. And so it works really well to have like fueling before you've got a pace change. So I did that, and just towards the end, I heard someone scream the time. I was like, oh, I gotta go. And so finished that in 146, and it was a very different experience than the 149, in that I felt that I was 100% at my maximum capability, but I wasn't redlining like that. Like I wasn't finishing like feeling, like I'd had to dig that deep into a well. It was much more like, I feel like this is maximum ability, but I also feel like I was able to enjoy it a lot more. So did that, and then kept on training, and then signed up for Melbourne again, and again picked something I had probably no right to be able to run, but I was like, oh, let's see if I can go under 140. Didn't take into account that if you don't run the tangents, you end up having to run like 21.3, not 21.1. And so although I was dead on target for like the sort of average pace I needed to be under 140, the reality is because I ended up running 21.3, it ended up being 140 and change, which was a huge improvement. Like anytime you improve by 6 minutes in that amount of time, there's no way you can be cranky about that. But still, in the back of my mind, I was like, it's a bit annoying that it's like however many seconds over 140. But I was really happy with being in the position that then I had this really great sort of like platform to build the next year on. And then I got home and I was on really reduced running just to sort of recover. So I was only running sort of like 30 kilometres a week. And I just had this persistent heel pain. And at first I thought, like my calves are just tight and whatever else. But it wouldn't go away, and it was not responsive to sort of like, I had like a masseuse look at it. And so eventually I went to the physio and said, it's probably just some entrapped nerves, and just sort of reduced the running more. And it was slightly improving, but not really. And even after a couple of weeks of no running at all, it was not really a huge improvement. And I was like, I do have scoliosis. I'm going to go to the osteo and just check out to see if there's anything structurally wrong here that I should be paying attention to, because the physio kind of saying, it just takes time and probably take a few months. I didn't really feel like he was appreciating the urgency of like not necessarily having to be back running, but needing a clear pathway to running, not like a kind of, we'll just wait and see. So I went to the osteo and she said, okay, so all of your bones on one side are out of position. And I'm like, that would be a good explanation as to why things are so rough. So she did the adjustments that she needed to do, but also assessed that there was a major strength imbalance on because of the scoliosis. And so that's when I went to an exercise physiologist who designed a program for me to rebuild that strength so I could get out of that chronic heel pain. And that process took many months. So I stopped running in November, and I had my first sort of 60-metre run in, I want to say, April. And then we just sort of started building up from there. And then probably by, I guess it would be by the time Gold Coast came around again in July, I was able to run with a friend for that, and we were able to run, I think it was like 152 or something. So that was really good in that I could see that although I still had a long way to go in terms of getting back to where I was, like it was not as far away from it as I thought. And so I just continued to train from there. And but I had, when Melbourne came around, like it was fine, but I just had a really rough day. It's probably the only time that I ever thought about like actually just walking off the course. And it was just like I'd started too far back, and so I was just like caught in traffic for ages. But even if I hadn't been caught in traffic, I just could not get up to the pace that I would normally run in training all the time. So that was mentally a really tough spot to be in, but I was just like, it's okay, just, like make it an honest effort and just finish it. And I did, and I think it was sort of like 146 or something like that. And so I then went into that then summer period, and I was like, okay, I'm going to, like start working with coach again and just sort of like build on. And I started doing sort of personal training as well, just to kind of like just do all of the things that was like, okay, I think that I could go faster, But if I'm going to do that, then I've got to be looking after all the little things, not just like going out for my running sessions. I'm like going to put my training in the hands of a coach so that they can guide that. They'll know what my strengths and weaknesses are. They'll know what I should be doing. They'll probably program things that I would never program in a million years. And I need to, like, more so than anything, I just need to be stronger. And so I sort of identified that as well as keeping up with all of my rehab and everything else. And so then that sort of culminated in the Canberra run, which ended up being 1:36, which was probably, like, I set things relatively aggressively, and I was sort of more or less able to stay on pace with that. And I'm just one of those people where I, generally speaking, on a good day, I can just go a lot faster in races than I can in training. I'm like, think that, you know, like generally people either, you know, what they do in training is what they can do on race day, and then there are some people who are kind of like slow trainers, fast racers. It's just like, I'm just able to use the environment to just push for that little bit more. And that's, so I'm always kind of aware of that and know, like, okay, like this seems really scary, but I can probably do this. And I had, as part of the taper, I had like 10K at, you know, my planned race pace, which I did. And that was actually the exact pace that I managed to do Canberra in. And, you know, like, it felt hard, but not like awfully hard. And so even though it's slightly intimidating to go, okay, you're going to do that twice, I was like, on a good day I probably could do it twice. And I was glad that I didn't know that Canberra was a little bit more hilly than what I was expecting. Sometimes ignorance is definitely a good thing in racing. So it is one of those things where there were a lot of ups and downs in that process. So, and I would say, like, a lot of my progress has been punctuated by things like either injuries, so like shin splints, which I now know everything there is to possibly know about shin splints, the adductor tear. And actually with the adductor tear, that should have been better diagnosed at the time, because that is 100% an indication of that strength imbalance I have. So, but it wasn't, and you just sort of, there are a whole bunch of things that it's really easy to compartmentalize and say, oh, well, you know, that's just runner stuff, which is not, it's bullshit. You know, it's, most of the time there is a reason for why something happens. Like, things don't just happen. Like, people just don't go off and tear an adductor. And so most of those things have been sort of punctuated by like injuries, and there have been loads of injuries. Like, I'm one of those people who's been fairly lucky in that most I've been, you know, pretty injury free for most of my running. And the injury last year was the first time I'd had any kind of like major injury. And it was kind of hard because like people would go, oh, like, what did you injure? And it's just like, it's not really an injury so much as just like the way my body is, and I'd gotten away with it for a certain amount of time, and then it just sort of like built up to the point where it was no longer fine. So it's not like, in some ways, like a muscle tear or a stress fracture would have been quicker and easier to deal with because that's a simple injury. But this was not simple. So, yeah, like, it's just really easy to kind of go, oh, that's just a runner thing. No, there's something else going on. And even like this last week, I had, which I think is probably just like a really minor calf strain. And I know why that happened. Like, that's not a mystery. That's me doing like a bunch of jumping at CrossFit and then going off and doing a semi-hard run afterwards, and the muscle just being too fatigued. And so that's something that then I'll go, okay, well, I'm not doing that again. So I think that you can sort of, those things have then gone on to inform like how I progress and what I decide are the priorities, but also like the mental space thing is huge. So, you know, in periods where other things going on require more of you, then that has been time where I've stepped back from it. I'm just gonna do whatever. Like I'm not gonna sort of have this I can't do hard work at the moment. But I do think a lot of that is not so much because I do go a bit batty if like I'm not sort of like training to a plan. Like I'm not one of those people who can just like not have structure to the workouts, because that's part of what I enjoy, even if I'm not specifically training for something. So I do 100% think that sometimes when you reach something that you never think that you'll reach, you can get a mental block there and be like, that's as good as it's ever going to get. I'm never going to get it any faster than that. I'm never going to get any better than that. And then it is the kind of thing where you have to sort of like look at it and go, yeah, but is that true? Or is that just something that I'm telling myself? And why am I telling myself that? What am I getting out of that? And, you know, like I got to the point where I was like, I would really like to know if everything was sort of like lined up, like if I trained really well, I took care of my health, I slept well, I put in the rehab and the strength work and everything else, like where is the limit of like what my capability is, because I don't quite think I'm there yet. And so that is something that helps to keep me motivated. And so that's sort of like part of the progress too, is just looking at it and sort of seeing what is gonna keep you going. Because over any long period of time like that, there are going to be like ups and downs with it. You know, like no one ever like just consistently gets better and better and better. You know, you kind of get better and then you have like recovery period and then get better again. And it has to be also, you know, like everyone in some way, shape or form dreads their intensity sessions. You know, like if it's not slightly scary, then it's probably not pushing you, you know. And it does not mean that you have to do those things or that you are just, it's all goal dependent, you know. So there are, you know, like if you have something like on your training plan and it's enough that you have so much resistance to doing it that you would actually like not run for a week to avoid doing it, then that's probably a bad idea, because you're always going to get more value out of consistency than you are out of intensity. And ideally, you know, like you would want sort of like both of those things. But if you can't have consistency with intensity, then lose intensity. But for me, having those things are part of what I, you know, like I don't necessarily, like I don't look at them, like say for example tomorrow I've got, which I still have not quite, because like my car felt pretty good today, but I'll probably try the first interval of this session, and if it feels funny I'll probably just pull the plug and do like something easy, because I just don't want to push it before it's ready. But so my session is like there's a warm-up, and usually the warm-up involves some shorter, like faster repetitions just to get the central nervous system ready to do some work. And then there are like 4 sets of 2 kilometres at my 10 kilometre pace. One of the perils of running a half marathon fast is that all of a sudden your 10 kilometre pace is a lot faster. But it is also good to keep in mind with things like that, because this is also a question that comes up in Run Club a bit, is like, okay, it says 10 kilometre pace. Is that my race pace? Is that how I'm feeling today? And it's good to have a range. So, you know, like that 10 kilometre pace that I ran at Canberra, which was like 45 minutes, so it's like 4:30 pace, that was with everything lined up perfectly on that day. I was fully tapered, was fully carved, had a good night's sleep, had the benefit of staying with my mum and her partner while I was in Canberra, and so it's like beating me, and you know, like I'm not having to do anything. I'm not stressed. Well, actually I was a little bit stressed that weekend. But generally speaking, if you have a good race, everything, all of the variables have lined up in a perfect manner for you to get the absolute most out of your body on that day. When I rock up to a training session tomorrow, that's not everything's going to be perfect. So I like to look at it as, okay, on a perfect day, at the moment, my 10K pace is like 4:30. But on an imperfect day, it's probably more like 4:45-ish. So, you know, like create a range for yourself so that you can just like run to how you feel, because that how it is on the day is just going to vary depending on what you've got going on, how much sleep you've had, how well you've eaten, you know, like are you stressed out, you know, are you coming down with something, whereabouts are you in your cycle, you know, like there are so many variables going in. So you need like a range, and a lot of times it's just a safety net, because you go into those things and it can be scary to fail, and you kind of look at it and go like, what if I can't do that? When intellectually you know that it is 100% just like the benefit is effort based. So, you know, like your body can't tell the difference if it's sort of like putting in an honest effort and you're running at, you know, like one pace versus an honest effort at another pace, just because on that day it's warmer, it's more humid, you only got, you know, like 5 hours sleep, you know, whatever it is. But by creating a range for yourself, you will you alleviate the pressure. So like if I can go into that going, oh, well, you know, like I'm still kind of like looking after what's happened with my calf, so I'm just going to try and go like under 5 minutes, and if I'm feeling good, I'll go faster. And 9 times out of 10, you will end up exactly on the pace that you're kind of scared of, because you'll get into it and you're like 1/5 of my race pace at a time before I have a 3-minute break is not that hard. So often creating that range just takes off the mental pressure, and then it allows you to perform at whatever level that you can perform at that day. So I think it is really good to look at your running training in terms of like, look at it in decades. Don't look at it in like 3 months or a year. Like look at it from like just like a really long view, because that's how it's built. It's not like, you know, like it's probably like, I think on you know, like the first year that I was running, I was probably averaging like about 12 hours of running a month roughly. And then like, I think it's, where have I got it? I've got it up here somewhere. And then, you know, like if I'm sort of looking more at, you know, 2014, it gets up to, you know, like it's more like probably of an average of like 30. And then in and much the same in 2015, actually looking at, there's an odd month here and there where it's a lot higher, where it goes up to 40, but most of the time it's still 30. And as I'm going through sort of 2016, where it was much more just me running, not really for, not really training as much. Again, it's still sort of like around 30. And then you get into 2017, it's much more like 40 to 50. And then and some of that too is like, that's not all running, that's like strength training. And I think that Strava includes all of that. And so then when you get into my sort of injury year, again, it's sort of like 40 to 50, but it includes things like swimming and biking and CrossFit and everything like that. And now, like this year, probably, like if I look, it's probably like closer to 60. But that's all built over a really long period of time. And if I'd sort of gone back to where I was when I started, there's no way I would have been able to incorporate, like if somebody had said to me, okay, you're going to, like run 6 times a week, you're going to, like go to the gym 3 times a week, you're doing, like all of this sort of like strengthening weaknesses at home, that would never have happened. It was all I could do just to go for a run every other day, and anything more than that I would have failed. And so then it's sort of like, then going into the next year, it's sort of like, well, I could probably run like 4 times a week instead of 3, and I could probably like go to a class at the gym like a few times a week too. And then that kind of stabilizes, and they're like, I could probably do like an easy run like after I go to the gym, and like I could probably do things 5 times a week. But you can't, you can jump over things, but it's a lot more sustainable if you don't, and you're just like building in things quite slowly. Because when I started going to the gym for CrossFit, there's no way I could have run on the same day. It was like completely gassed. There's no way that would have been happening. Whereas now I actually quite enjoy it. One, because I have a better kind of capacity for different levels of intensity. So like I can go to the gym and then like do a run that really intensity wise barely feels like anything above a walk, and I've outgrown any kind of like ego thing I might have had about my run being slower than whatever it is, and I'm totally fine with some days my like easy pace being 2 minutes per kilometre slower than what I would normally run, because that's the purpose of that run, is just like for it to be easy. For me to feel like I'm not even running, but I'm getting things moving. I'm, like sort of like it's good recovery from the gym for me. And it's also just that good mental time at the beginning of the day where I can just have time to sort of, to not be doing things for other people. It's just sort of like my time to just sort of kind of regenerate all my introvertness, which is a good thing to have when you have 2 extroverted children. So yeah, like I think that it can be easy to kind of like look at what somebody's schedule is and, like want to emulate it. And I've certainly felt that way in the past, like looking at what other people do and like, they're doing really well, I should do what they're doing. But the reality is that has taken decades to build in. And if you, like me, have sort of come into running later in life, you don't have the benefit of having like created all of these things through, like high school and university and all of that. It's all new, so it all takes time. And over time it does get easier. Like one of the main reasons I originally went to CrossFit is because I really struggled to motivate myself to do any strength training at home. Whereas now, I quite enjoy it. Like, so I just sort of allow for, like, I do sort of more strict strength at home because I get less of that at the gym. So it's much more like doing, you know, like something for like 5 sets of 5 where you're sort of resting a lot in the middle, which is a lot easier to do at home because it's not sort of, there's just a requirement that you focus on what you're doing, you're intentional, you get lots of rest, you sort of like listen to podcasts or whatever while you're doing it. So yeah, I think it's great to have that kind of context going in, and also really good to look at, like, if you are pretty comfortable in like what your routine is and you feel like you've got the capacity to add something in, look at where is the biggest hole, but also the easiest thing to do something about. So, you know, like sometimes that might be like, okay, I could do like an extra run, but would I be better off taking that time and doing like meal prep for the week so I'm not continually sort of like under-fueled or under-recovered, and see how that looks like? Or would I be better off not doing this extra sort of strength thing at night and just going to bed earlier because I need that sleep time? So it's sort of like really good to look at what is going to take the least amount of effort but is going to have the highest impact. And, you know, it might take a little bit of experimenting to figure out what that is, but you can just sort of like play around and see what is going to work for you, because 100% the thing that is going to have the biggest impact on your training is sleep. Like, if that is not a thing that is working for you, then that is like, if somebody's not adapting to training, the first thing I would look at is sleep, which is very unsexy. No one wants to sleep. Well, everyone wants to sleep more, but you don't necessarily want to sacrifice the other things you do to sleep more. And you can take a really slow and gradual approach to sleep. Like, I noticed a few months ago that I was averaging like 6.5 hours sleep. It's like, it's probably not enough. And so I've gotten to the point now where it's like, it's up more like around 7.5. I'd still like to get it over 8 if I can. And part of the sacrifices that I make for that is, like, a lot of times why that sleep is low is because I like to get up super early to get all my training in and then still have like a full day to do the other things that I need to do. But sometimes that's going, hey, you know, no point getting up and doing all that training if you just sleep deprived because of it. So sometimes, particularly now, like in periods when the kids are at school, I can go, okay, I'm going to sleep in, I'm going to do that stuff while they're at school, and yeah, that makes a shorter day for me, but I need that sleep, and, you know, I can't run on empty forever. So sometimes it is challenging that more is more sort of approach to things, which I understand is very, very tempting. But looking at things like sleep and nutrition are probably, in some ways, they're a lot harder than just like doing an extra run, but will pay bigger dividends than that extra run, because the extra run is going to do nothing for you if you don't have the ability to recover from it. So a lot of it is looking after those sorts of little things before you add in like a bigger thing. And you can tell if you're not recovering well because you'll probably, you know, you'll feel like you're carrying fatigue into workouts. You'll probably feel hungry all the time. You know, you just find that it's hard to get up. Whereas even like I can tell when I'm in a good patch, because even though I'm getting up super early to go to the gym, when that happens, like I feel ready to get up because I've gone to bed at a reasonable hour. And sometimes if the week hasn't panned out the way I would hope, and I've been a little bit low on sleep, then I'm just going, well, work from home, I have the ability to nap before I pick up the kids from school. That's what I'm going to do. So, yeah, progress is one of those things that everyone wants it to be in a straight line, but it's not. But also, it's one of those things that you want to be aware of like not discounting. Like if you are looking at, what you want to achieve and where you are, and you feel like, I'm putting in all of this work and I'm not improving, that's also not something that I would discount. There's probably a really good reason for that. And you just need to find out what that is. So I also wouldn't ignore it and go, oh, well, like it'll happen eventually. Like maybe it won't, because you are probably doing something that is not necessarily like addressing those weaker areas. So, like for me, one of the things that when it pops up on my training plan that I know is a weakness is things that are around the like mile to 3K sort of pace. Because, and it's very easy to tell like where your distance weaknesses is. So like if you put like a race result into like one of those online calculators, it will spit out, okay, like if you run a half marathon in this pace, then this should be your pace for like the marathon, the 10K, 5K, 3K mile. And if I look at that, like I know I don't often have an occasion to sort of like run a 3-kilometre time trial, thankfully, or a mile, but I can look at that and I can know that the half is my strongest distance, and my weakest would probably be 5K is not that bad, but my weakest would probably be that 3K, that sort of that time domain for me. So I know when it shows up on my training plan that it's going to be a pretty hard session for me to manage that, but it's also going to be of the biggest benefit, because if you can strengthen up that weak spot, then it's going to make everything else that much stronger. And the reality is like if I was doing everything to my strength, which is like much more, like I'm quite good at all of this sort of threshold stuff, particularly if there are breaks in there. I love a good break. So if I was just doing things that made me feel good and made me feel strong and made me feel fit, then it's not really doing myself any favors, because it's not working on the things that I'm not good at, which is like I've gotten better at it because I've done so many of them now, but progression runs quite scare me because there's no stopping, and it's just like it just gets harder and harder and harder as you go along. But that is a really great thing for like race specific training, because that is 100% what I'm going to be doing. It's going to be a progression run, and I'm not going to get a break. So yeah, it is kind of looking at maybe the things that you most struggle with are things that you are either unconsciously avoiding, or you're using a standard training plan that is forced to make assumptions about you. So, like if you look at sort of a standard half marathon training plan or something like that, you're going to have long runs, and you're going to have, you're going to have your sort of like tempo-y stuff, you're going to have some half marathon pace stuff, you're probably going to have some hills in there for strength. You're probably going to have some harder intervals, things like that. But, say for example, it might be a thing where you're really good at the kind of like the long, slow distance run, but you really struggle with like picking up speed at the end of a run when you're tired. Then it doesn't matter how many easy runs you do, you're never going to get better at that. And you might need to go, okay, like I need to have some negative split runs. I need to like sort of like work in the more moderate runs, like so that not everything is at a pace that's super comfortable for me, something that's going to sort of emulate like a race type scenario a bit better, or whatever it is is for you. So it's sort of like, it is always worthwhile investigating, is this working? If it's not working, why isn't it working? Like, if the first place I would always go is sort of like sleep and food would be the first thing. If you feel like that's pretty much on board, then you've got to look at the specifics of the training. And then the first step that I would go with that is going, okay, like, where are my weak time domains and how often do I hit that in a training cycle? Because if it's not that much, then that's definitely what I would work on. And, you know, if you kind of like look at round about where your certain PBs should be in various distances, and one is way out, there's usually one that's way out. Few people are super balanced in that way. And mine are definitely sort of, because the half marathon is the strength, things that are a lot longer than that tend to be weaker than they should be, and things that are super short tend to be weaker than they should be. And there's also an indication that, you know, with being weaker in the shorter stuff, to me that's also like, it just confirms that I need to be doing more strength training to get stronger, because speed is not so much about going faster as it is about being more powerful. And I can tell from how awful my jumping is at the gym that that's also something that I need to work on. So I think that you can sort of then take a look at that and then apply some changes, but for a decent amount of time. It's no good doing something for a couple of weeks and going, oh, well, it didn't work. Like, you need like a full cycle at least, and probably really like a couple of cycles to really assess if those changes are helping you. And you can also just look at, like, in anything, like, what's the hard bit? Like, for me, it's always like the middle bit. It's like that bit where you're like halfway, you're like, yay, halfway, and then you're like, oh, I've still got a long way to go. And is it mental? Because that could very well be a thing, that it might not be physical at all. Or, you know, like, so whether it's sort of like endurance based or is it power based, are you just particularly interested in a type of distance that doesn't naturally suit your body? Which doesn't mean don't do it, but it does mean, like, what can you do to sort of like offset that? You know, like if we're looking at like a slow twitch versus fast twitch things, like, you can move those numbers, but you need to change the way you're training in order to do it. So yeah, and I've gone on for a really long time now in episode 100. And so hopefully you've been able to get a sense of how nuanced the process of progress is, and you've gotten something that you'll be able to use and take into your own training, or at least know that for any time someone sets a PB, there's like a huge backstory for everything, and it's very rare that no one just lands there. You know, there's always like all of these things that happen along the way. And yeah, for sure, like, some people have natural talent and have always been, you know, on the sort of spectrum of like running pace, it's always been relatively fast, but vast majority of people just start at the beginning. And, you know, I think that there's a lot of fun in being at the beginning, and you can, there are so many new things to explore in the beginning. You don't want to sort of like wish yourself too far forward or too far out of it, you know, because you always remember those beginning things. And, you know, it's the kind of thing that you want to stay in the moment with it, and just know that progress is a really long game, ideally. You know, that's what you want. you wouldn't want it to be a short thing, because then what would you do after that? It's not, you want to embrace it as a really long process, and one that you can be involved in for a really long time. And before I go, just a reminder that you can join Run Club at any time. It has training plans across a whole range of distances, whole different levels based on days per week, along with weekly workouts for running and for strength. And has an amazing Facebook group community as well. And you can also have those training plans delivered through an app, so it goes into your calendar and everything like that, which makes it super easy, as well as giving you discounts to custom training plans if you want something that's a little bit more specific to you. And you can just, that's all on the website. You can just sign up to that through the shop. And if you have any questions about it at all, just let me know and we can have a chat. So that's it for today, before I lose my voice. And hopefully, now that I have children out of the office, I will be back next week, but it will just depend on how all of the coaching stuff through the week pans out. But I will speak to you next time.